Out of the street corners they scream. You knew it was coming. You've been waiting for this for months. Rumour hardened into fear and now they scream at you. The sirens, their hysterical wail tearing through the white noise of the city. And you run. You run to pick up those things that can never be replaced. A picture of them in the days when they still loved you. Your mother's wedding ring. And then you turn to your shelf of games. You only have room for 5. 5 games for Doomsday. 5 Games for Doomsday is a show in which board game personalities are thrust into a cabin in the woods to outrun an oncoming disaster, but can only take 5 of their games with them. But which will they choose? My guest this week is currently most well known for his writing about games. An ardent advocate of the thematic, he's written for Shut Up and Sit Down, the Haynes Manual of Board Games, and is the inventor of the term Ameritrash. Currently, he is writing for the Board Game Book. My guest this week is Matt Thrower. Matt, welcome to the cabin.
Oh, it's beautiful to be here. It's so horrible outside that it's just a delight to be indoors, to be honest, even if I had to spend it with you.
To begin, how difficult was it for you to choose the 5 games to take to the cabin with you?
It was an interesting exercise. I've always admired this show because I think it asks a really interesting question in terms of what 5 games you play for the rest of your life, because that's a very different question for what are your favourite 5 games. In fact, one of the games I've chosen, it wouldn't even make it near my top 20, 40 probably even. And I found it easier than I expected to make a shortlist of about 10 or 12, and then I found it much harder than I expected to actually whittle that down to 5.
I mean, what are your criteria? Are you someone who's prone to nostalgia about games, sentimentality?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I am, but I don't think I've chosen particularly sentimental games. But definitely, I'm a nostalgic for the olden days of gaming when things were simpler and kids knew their place and blah 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 and all that sort of stuff. But my criteria really, I was trying to think about it literally from the point of view if I can only play 5 more games for the rest of my life, I want them to be as varied as possible. So I want, as much content in them as possible as I can get, different play modes, what games are going to cross genres, and things like that to really kind of just get the widest pool of different experiences as I could with the most minimal number of games.
I mean, I think it's interesting when you mention sort of gaming, being simpler. I mean, we always kind of imagine everything simpler in our past. We forget how miserable every day is when we think back when it's been, varnished over 20 years. But it seems to me that gaming has been working towards ever more simplicity. I think if you look at the goal of sort of game design over the last 20 years, it seems to me, to try and really perfect that sort of maximum depth with minimum complication. Have you seen that over your time as a gamer, that there's less fiddliness to games, more elegance?
It depends how far back you go. That's a really interesting observation because I actually don't think it has. Now, when you go back to the late 90s, that was definitely true. There was an awful lot of bloat around, and then games like Settlers of Catan obviously was the thing that kick-started it all, and games like Carcassonne and other things showed people in Europe and America, because they came from Germany, of course, these game designs, how much better games could be, how much simpler and more accessible games could be. And for some years, that aesthetic definitely reigned. But after that, things began to build and become more and more complicated. If you compare a game like Puerto Rico, say, just for the sake of argument, to Ra. Puerto Rico is obviously, it's not complicated by the standards of the campaign for North Africa, but it's a lot more complicated than Ra. And then you go on to look at something like Agricola, and that's an order of magnitude more complicated again. And so I think there has been, the actual driver has been, designers have been trying to get as many. It's a balance. It's a balance between trying to get as many different factors, scoring, strategies, etc., into games for the minimum amount of rules. Yeah, that doesn't always mean that you actually have the minimum amount of rules. You can get an awful lot of game out of something like Ra and Modern Art and other late 90s games out of very little rules, where you've got these big point salad games Le Havre, there's another example. They're moderately complicated, and yeah, they've got lots of depth and replayability, but they're not accessible in the way that Eurogames were back in the late 90s. I'm going to waffle now, but I actually think this is beginning to come back into fashion just recently. Really simple games. I played a brilliant game this week called Caravan, which is a really, really neat pick up and deliver game. It's got literally one page of rules, and yet there's so much game in that box. It really quite blew me away. And there have been other games that I've thought that about recently. I think that real drive for real simplicity is starting to come back into vogue again, but it hasn't been for a long time.
And I mean, when I think of sort of the indicator of the drive for simplicity, I think about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. And inevitably, as more things come out, complexity will be reintroduced. But there was a real desire to strip that back from the sort of the bloat of 3.5 and then the computer game elements of 4th edition. And you're a person who's been deeply and then tangentially connected to miniatures games. Has that revolution hit miniatures games, or are they just as complex now as they've always have been? Has there been a desire to sort of strip back on those sorts of things?
I think there's a slight misnomer there in that they've always been complicated, because I don't think they have. The big ones that gamers know about, the big ones that are in sort of like the hobby eye, the public eye, archetypically the Games Workshop games, yes, they are very complicated, and no, there's been no real impact on those games until very recently. I'll come back to that in a second, in terms of making them simpler, but under the radar there have always been much simpler games around, in fanzines, self-published stuff, and from smaller wargaming companies and things. So they've always existed, and it's only very recently that Games Workshop has kind of got on that bandwagon. A few years ago, they got rid of Warhammer Fantasy Battle and replaced it with Age of Sigmar, which was a much simpler game. And unfortunately, though, it's part of their model, I think, is just part of their profit model, to be honest, is just to make things more and more bloated.
Yeah, and so, I mean, you're a person for whom theme, story, narrative, drama is vital. Does complexity or simplicity lend itself to that, or is that just a vacuous question?
No, it's a really, really good question, actually. That's really interesting, because I like very much to be carried away by a game. I like very much to get, to let it really excite me and to really enthrall me and get into it. And although I do play a lot of moderately to extremely complicated games, complexity is actually the enemy of that. Because when you have to stop every 5 minutes and check a rule book or check the position of a figure on the table or whatever it is that you have to do, that breaks that immersion. And often I find myself just charging in like a bull in a china shop and getting stuff wrong in my excitement just to carry on with the game, because it's the game that matters. It's the experience that's drawn me in. That's what I really want, not to be interrupted. And yet, the sorts of games that I like, those thematic, dramatic games, if you like, do tend to be higher on the complexity scale. I am very fond of those old-fashioned Euros as well, to go back again to things like Ra and Modern Art. I enjoy those as well. I also find those to be intensely exciting, dramatic games. But I do like a good dose of theme, a good dose of story that those tend not to have in the same amount. And it's a shame in a way that it seems to be so hard for designers to get a lot of theme out of games without also having a lot of rules.
And you're also a wargamer, and they're sort of infamous, whether this is just a sort of a myth or not, but they're infamous for having, you roll dice to see if the gun works, you roll dice to see if it hits the tank, you roll dice to see which part of the tank it hits, you roll to see if it goes through the shield, and so on and so on and so on. I assume you consider wargames equally as thematic and full of story as fantasy games or sci-fi games. Does the complexity aid them, or do they get bogged down in the same way that other games do?
Well, that, again, another very good question. Now, when the whole thing about Ameritrash at first blew up, if you like, a lot of people said that war games were the ultimate Ameritrash games, because if you want story, if you want narrative, then a war game is completely where it's at. The ideal war game is something that recreates in blow-by-blow detail, genuine historical encounters, and looks at the way that alternative histories can unfold. So, yes, in the sense that they are definitely richly narrative experiences. But on the flip side, although I do play war games, although I do enjoy war games and I enjoy history and military history, I have shied away from the really hard end of war games, and it is because of the point that I made just before, because along with my theme and narrative, I also like real drama and excitement, and war games tend not to have that, or if they do have it, it is very slow moving. It's a very slowly moving, unfolding drama, like a Jane Austen novel as opposed to some penny dreadful thriller, And a lot of war gamers, if you look at the way that they play their games, they take it very, very slowly, and they take it very, very seriously, and they think very hard. There's a lot of depth in war games that I think people who don't play them don't appreciate. There's a lot of deep thinking and strategy in the best war games, but that very slow speed is not for me. I'll give you an example of a game that I played, a relatively simple war game called Victory Lost. It was really popular. It made kind of that crossover. Some war games make that crossover into the more mainstream thing because it was relatively simple. But the trouble with the Victory Lost is that it was something like, on average, there would be like 100 Soviet counters on the map at any one time. And one of the things that happened during the Soviet player's turn is that at one point they would get to move all their counters. Now, if you played that with somebody face-to-face, which I never did, I used to play it via email, I spoke to people at this and they said, oh, yeah, we just go out for dinner while he makes his move because it's going to take like an hour, 2 hours. And that's not my gaming. That's not what I want from a game.
So I want to go back to the beginning now. So you said in the bio that you sent me that you grew up in Northern Ireland in the 70s, which was sort of the centre of the Troubles. Do you have any memories of being in Northern Ireland at that time and sensing that the Troubles were there? Because you were reasonably young when you were there.
Yes, I left when I was about 8 or 9. Generally, no. My parents worked extremely hard to shield me from it. Very hard. I remember my mum told me, and I have no memory of this at all, she said that when there were riots and bombs going off down in the town, which there were, she would go around putting mattresses up against the windows to stop them breaking. And I have no recollection of that, but apparently she did. And so they worked very hard to shield me from it, and I think the people of Northern Ireland indirectly also shielded me from it because they knew my family was English, and my understanding is, looking back on it now as an adult, that there was kind of like a tacit understanding that we were not part of that struggle. Yeah. And
what were your parents doing there?
Oh, that's my father had a rather unusual calling in life. He was a sewage chemist, so he looked after water treatment plants. And as I'm sure you can imagine, it's a pretty specialised job. And at the time, it was just the only place that he could get a job. So off we went.
And so, I mean, you're a person who's into history. Have you returned to Northern Ireland since you left? And secondly, when you've looked into the Troubles, has it given you a perspective on that time of history or an affinity for that time of history that you don't think you would have had you have not spent formative years there?
I have never been back. No, I don't have any connection with it anymore. It's funny actually that in the age of the internet, I was struck a couple of years ago. You know how everybody finds out that they get to touch with their old school friends over Facebook and finds out they're all massive racists now. I never did that with people from Northern Ireland, and I don't know why. And it suddenly struck me that I could do that a couple of years ago. And I didn't find anyone on Facebook, but I did find out that my best friend from Northern Ireland is now a chemistry teacher, and he plays in a bagpipe band, a marching bagpipe band. And I was quite tempted to write to him, actually, but I didn't. I mean, it's been so many years now that I thought he might think it was a bit weird, and I don't know what kind of person he is anymore. He might be somebody that I wouldn't get on with nowadays. So I've never been back, and I've never strongly been tempted to go back, largely just because there's other places I want to go. Time off to go places, go visiting is precious, and there's so many places I want to go. But in terms of What impact? Yes, I am interested in it. I do still follow the politics and the news of Northern Ireland fairly closely. I have read up about it. I do suppose have an affinity with it. And it's a scary time for Northern Ireland with Brexit. And that's something that was largely overlooked, I think, during the vote and in the aftermath, how disruptive it was going to be.
And so, where did you go to school when you were there? Did you go to a segregated school? Was there a particular sort of English school, or did you go to school in a particular area?
Well, luckily, I lived literally across the road from a school, so I went to that school. In terms of whether it was segregated, yes, it was. I think all schools were segregated, pretty much. Whether they still are, I don't know. It was a Protestant school, so although I say that I kind of got a pass from people in Northern Ireland, or my family did, because we were English, I still think we were expected largely to fall in with the Protestant line and the Protestant way of thinking. Where I lived, I did have one friend, and this is the only thing that ever kind of hove into my consciousness about there. I had one friend who was a Catholic. He lived at the top of my road. He went to a different school because he was a Catholic. He went to a different, a Catholic school, and he did introduce occasionally. Disrupted my placid life, if you like, with some of the things that he said, not in an aggressive way. He was a perfectly nice man, but I remember, was it really stuck in my head. I remember we were sat playing, having sandwiches, I can't remember now, and his mum went out the door with one of those pulling shopping trolleys, and she said, she's off to the riots. And I said, what? And she said she's got all her petrol bombs and things in the shopping trolley, and she's off to the riots to go and throw them at the police. And I suspect that was a lie, but the point is that he was in tune with that rebellion, if you like, in a way that I, in the Protestant community, wasn't. Because it was, it's far more important to the Catholic identity.
So I want to move on. In the bio you sent me, you credit a single book with changing your life and making you into a gamer. So what was that book, and what effect did it have on you?
The book is called What is Dungeons and Dragons, by three kids. There's a whole fascinating story behind this, which I'll try not to bore you too much with. Three kids who were at Eton at the time, and they were actually part of a very large group of very active people who've gone on to be movers and shakers in the games industry. Another one is James Wallace, who designed one of the games that I'm going to talk about later on. And there were some other people involved in that. And on the fringes of that group, apparently, was David Cameron, who used to play a dwarf in their Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Well,
he's currently running a campaign to see if he can destroy a country with an idiotic decision,
and then hide in his shed. But yes, but it's so my gaming heroes, if you like, ended up, they originally played D&D with David Cameron. But yeah, until I bought that book, and I found it on a bookstall. I was bored one day in an agricultural fair in North Norfolk, which is where my family come from originally and where we went to after we came back from Northern Ireland. And just bored, rootling about, found this book. It had a dragon on the cover, nothing else on the table looked interesting, so I bought it for like £1, £2 or something, and went back to where my parents were and sat and read the book. And I was immediately hooked by the extraordinary idea that you could relive a fantasy world in such incredible detail that it was you and your friends to create and live and breathe and make your own. I loved that. It absolutely captured my imagination. And it has to be said, at the time, there was in the last chapter of the book, it wasn't just about Dungeons and Dragons. They had other games in there like Warhammer and White Bear, Red Moon, and some of the other early Avalon Hill war games and stuff like that. And I did not know these games existed, and they sounded so wonderful that I immediately went and begged my parents to get me Redbox D&D, Redbox Basic Dungeons and Dragons, which they did. And it was not as good as I had hoped, I suppose, if I'm honest, but it was still pretty damn good.
And so you went on from D&D into a world that seems even more sort of arcane, and that was Games Workshop. How important has Games Workshop been to you as a gamer, and how much did it go to forming your sort of ethos around games?
Oh, hugely, because it was, as a gamer, Dungeons and Dragons, of course, TSR is American. Avalon Hill is American. All these companies were American, and Games Workshop started life as an importer of American games before it started publishing its own games. And it is impossible to really overstate, as somebody who was in Britain, who was alive in that era, how totally formative it was. Games Workshop was everything in the hobby in Britain up until the late 80s, probably. So Games Workshop was independently owned up until, I don't know the actual dates, but late 80s I think it was. And then there was a management buyout. So the people who owned Games Workshop were kicked out by, it wasn't doing terribly well financially, I don't think, and it was bought out by some of the senior staff, and they refashioned it into what it is today, which is a company that produces and sells its own games exhaustively. Before that time, as I say, it was an importer and a republisher, and the house magazine White Dwarf was the premier UK gaming magazine. You'd buy an issue of White Dwarf, there would be Warhammer stuff in it, there'd be Dungeons and Dragons stuff in it, there would be video game review stuff in it, there'd be all sorts of material in that magazine. It was a wonderful magazine. I've still got hundreds of them in my loft somewhere upstairs, mostly without covers, and literally overnight it changed. Literally overnight it went from being this incredible magazine to being a Games Workshop catalogue. And it broke my heart. And it broke the heart of a lot of gamers. And that is partly why I walked away from Games Workshop at that time. I walked away from Warhammer. I had been a Warhammer player just for fun, with my friends at the weekend and things like that. And I didn't touch it again for years and years and years because I was angry. I was angry, frankly, and people at the time were really worried about what it was going to do to hobby gaming. There was a concern that it was going to swallow up, because it became very successful, commercially successful, and there was a worry that it was going to swallow up everything, and everything that it swallowed up was going to kind of vanish into a black hole, because, again, another piece of history you may not be aware of, about 15 years ago, there was a huge litigation push from Games Workshop to wipe everything unauthorized off the internet. Vast archives of material vanished again overnight from Board Game Geek and from forgotten corners of the internet where it once was, and it was very much a corporate machine and not something that you felt was on the side of gamers, I suppose. And it took me a very, very long time to get over that and kind of like reprocess it into a point where I was happy playing their games again.
I mean, how important do you think the new CEO of Games Workshop has been? There seems to have been, in the last sort of 5 years, a big shift towards recognising the importance of the internet and the importance in independent bloggers and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just that. He's been transformative, because it's not just the points that you make, which are correct and valid, but they've also gone back to their root with box games, and the box games they're putting out now generally are extremely good. And it's the sort of material that I want to play, and they are behaving more now like a very big games company, but a games company that is interested in gamers and gaming rather than just the bottom line, which is how it had appeared for a long time.
So I want to move on to your first game then. Your first game is not an old game, it's a relatively modern one. And this is Gloomhaven. So what debt do you think that Gloomhaven has to those kind of games that you were playing in the 80s and to Games Workshop?
I think surprisingly little, actually. I mean, the games in the 80s that I was playing, games in the 80s, board games in the 80s generally, they couldn't escape the shadow of hex and counter war games, gridded war games. And so even tactical dungeon crawls were at their heart tactical war games of the sort with a big overlay of fantasy on them. And of course, Gloomhaven is that. So in the sense that it is, in that sense, it owes a debt to those games, which in turn owe a debt to war games. But then again, dozens upon hundreds of games owe that debt to the war games of the 70s. Really, everything beyond that is very, very modern, and owes a debt far more to sort of like there was a big, in the early 2000s, there was a big move toward fusion games, what I like to call fusion games, which blended the best bits of what I called Ameritrash with emerging European design skill and ideas. And Gloomhaven is really in that family, and perhaps at the apogee of that family almost, because it's a tactically and strategically very challenging game, and yet it is also complicated, and some of that complication comes from its huge thematic overlay, if you like.
And so what does Gloomhaven offer you as a gamer? What brings you back to it, and what makes you think that you'd like to spend Doomsday with it?
Well, there's a lot of reasons. It was actually the first game on my list. It was the only one, when I was making the shortlist, it was the first one on there, and it was the only one I think that at no point came off it when I was thinking about the 5. And it is, again, another thing that will become apparent as we talk about these games. I think 3 of the games I've chosen are ones where you play cards to do stuff on the map. Because I love games where you play cards to do stuff on the map. They absolutely delight me. That interplay between hand management, the Euro-esque, if you like, hand management of doing stuff with cards and working out best of card for those, with the far more traditional wargamey style things of positioning stuff on a map to make the best use of those cards, is something that just gives me no end of pleasure. It's the way that the two feedback in this wonderful loop, if you like, of strategically interesting and stimulating decisions. So I really like that about it. It's got a particularly novel element. For people who don't know it, you play 2 cards a turn, and the cards are divided into 2. So you have to use the top half of one and the bottom half of the other, which again limits what you can do in strategically and tactically interesting ways. If I was going to spend Doomsday with it, I spoke when I said about I was making my choices. I wanted a game with variety. Look at the size of the damn box. All right? Branching campaign. A campaign you could play dozens of times and not have the same narrative come out twice. There's all the mysteries in the box for you to uncover, for other people to uncover. I've played a lot of them, obviously, but you're playing it with new people, presumably in Doomsday. It is a cooperative game. I'm not generally fond of cooperative games. It's the only one on my list. But it's one that I really enjoy. I like the cooperative aspects of it. You can play it solo as well, which I might want when I'm bored in a corner of the shelter one day. And even beyond all of that, it's also got, as well as the campaign, a actually quite interesting random dungeon generator that you can play. So yeah, the short answer is it's a strategically and tactically challenging and interesting game with a fascinating world attached to it and huge variety and replayability.
It's a human truth that as soon as something gets successful, there will be those that try to denude it of that success. And, it's number 1 on Board Game Geek. It has a huge reputation. And so, of course, when you see the discussions about this game, people are divided very much into 2 camps on it. Do you think it deserves either the acclaim or the derision that it gets?
I don't know about the number 1 spot on Board Game Geek, because that's a function of so many things that it's almost meaningless. It's a coveted prize, but it's an excellent game that I thoroughly enjoy. I have a great time every time I sit down and play it. So I absolutely think that it deserves the acclaim that it gets. As you say, that acclaim is always going to create naysayers in people that don't like it, and I understand why people don't like it. And they are entitled to their view. I can't really say much more than that. I do understand where people are coming from. It is, I think, I've said this before in the post. I think somebody should release, or the designer should release an edition of Gloomhaven with the campaign stripped out. Just an ordinary size box, because have you seen the size of the Gloomhaven box? It's bloody enormous. I couldn't believe it when I get boxes of games from time to time, and I got this box one day and I opened it up and there was one game inside it, and I couldn't believe it. Size of the damn thing. You could kill a small child with it. And so imagine a version of Gloomhaven that came in an ordinary size box and only had 6 to 8 characters. I think the 6 starting characters didn't have all the narrative cards, didn't have the overland map, didn't have the campaign, just had the random dungeon generator with some monsters and some tiles. I think that would be 95% of what I enjoy about Gloomhaven.
So I want to go on now and talk about your studies and then your sort of nascent career in writing. So you studied biochemistry. What was it about biochemistry that drew you? I mean, is it spending days down the sewer with your dad?
No. It was not a lot to do with my dad, I don't think, although I think he liked the idea that I was doing something that was related to what he did for his job. I have always been, from a very early age, fascinated by biology. I don't really know why, in a way, in the sense that I can't put it's something that's very fundamental to me. I'm just fascinated by animals, extinct animals, living animals. They are just such extraordinary things, such extraordinary biological machines, really. Just, I don't know, really, dynamic, exciting, interesting. So, the wonderful variety of nature in all its colour and mystery. And there are mysteries, dinosaurs, what happened to the dinosaurs, what were they like? How I was fascinated by dinosaurs as a child, these great monsters, real monsters that roamed the earth, and there are still monsters that roam the earth, and I think that's just amazing. A never-ending source of pleasure. I still read about it, I still thoroughly enjoy it. And when I was making my decisions about where I was going to go, so I think it was quite clear that that's where I was going to do something in the life sciences. I chose biochemistry because I wanted to know at the most fundamental level what the answers were. It wasn't enough for me just to say plants make sunlight out of food. Plants make food out of sunlight. I wanted to know exactly how plants made food out of sunlight, down to the most minute detail. And that essentially is what biochemistry is.
And so what do you think? I mean, we're currently looking towards science to sort of bring us back from the abyss. Do you think biochemistry can help with that? What can biochemistry do for us?
Absolutely. I mean, it certainly can. I have been out of the loop of that world for such a long time that I can't give you a definitive answer to that. But I have thought that the only realistic solution to the climate change crisis that we face is a scientific one, because you are not going to get people to vote to go back to living in a simpler, carbon-free world, and until it's too late, by which time it'll be too late. And so the only possible solution that we have to this is scientific. Now, there's two ways of looking at that. Either we can do what is currently happening, which is looking to physics to create a more sustainable way of generating energy, or we can look to biology to try and do something about the carbon in the atmosphere. Because, of course, carbon is the primary molecule of living organisms. That's what we're all built out of. It's the basis of everyone's metabolisms. So there are conceivable biological solutions to sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere. Biology is very good at doing things that physics can't. A really good example of this is not physics can't, that people can't work out how to do. Muscles are the only way in which, it certainly were when I was at university, in which you can convert stored chemical energy in food directly to kinetic energy, as in motion. Every other way has to go through a series of transformations, and those transformations are inefficient, so you lose energy at every step. So, you burn fuel in a power station, which drives a turbine, which then turns into electricity, which then comes to your house. Every time that energy is transferred from one into another kind, something is lost. So it could be that biology is the answer to a more efficient world. It could be that biology is an answer to getting carbon out of the atmosphere. And sorry, can you just and it's it seems like there has to be something that it will offer over the coming years to help us out of this hole.
And so you went into your studies with every intention of becoming an academic, and then you didn't, and you said you fell out of love with academia. What was it about academia that sort of pushed you away?
I don't think I would ever have been in love with being in academia. I loved being a student, not just because it allowed me to stay in bed until noon and drink vast amounts of beer, but because I loved the learning. I loved learning, and I loved finding out all these. I really wanted to know the answer to these questions, and really I had wonderful moments in lecture theatre. It's like, that's how it works. This is how it. Oh my God, that's amazing. But actual academia in the modern age is so specialised that it is, again, going back to the gaming. Actually, it is that thing about me wanting to be invested in excitement over the long, patient slog of your 2 hours moving 100 Russian counters. People talk about academia being 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration, and that's a bloody exaggeration. It's not that much inspiration. My doctorate, I did a doctorate, I didn't write it up, so I'm not a doctor, but my doctorate was studying the genetic diversity of one species of bacteria in one lake in West Africa. And that, thrill in discovery is the fundamental of the natural world. That's not there, because almost all the fundamental discoveries of the natural world have already been made. And now the cutting edge of research is just slog after slog after slog on these massive edge cases, hoping that they're going to turn up something exciting.
And so you went on, you worked in another career, and then you did the normal thing that people do, which is have children. And you said that it was during the birth of your bringing up your first daughter and her refusing to sleep, that's when you started to write about games in those sort of witching hours of the morning. To what extent was this a substitute for your gaming, writing about them?
Totally. It was a substitute for my gaming, absolutely. That's exactly what started me off. I had all these thoughts, these things, and I used to talk about them to friends at gaming clubs and on online forums and things like that. But when that was sort of like all taken away from me, I still desperately wanted to have an outlet for it. And in those days, the only gaming I did was play by email. This is partly where my interest in old-fashioned hex and counter war games sprang from. And I wrote about them, and I wrote about other games. And yeah, it was absolutely, to start with, a substitute for actually getting to play all the games that I wanted to play. No question. I had no thought that it was ever going to go anywhere, that I'd be any good at it or anything like that. There was no expectation of that whatsoever. I did it purely because I just wanted an outlet to be with gamers and talk about games.
And what sort of stuff were you writing? So you said you were writing on BGG. I guess you would have been one of the first people to use BGG regularly. I mean, what kind of stuff were you writing, and how good was it?
I don't think I was one of the first. I think I was early. I don't know about that. There was certainly already a very thriving community there when I found Board Game Geek for the first time. What I started writing was reviews, mostly, of the games that I was playing online and games that I had played before we had kids. And when I look back at it, because I do, if I'm honest, I creep back under cover of darkness to some of my old writing now and again and have a look and see what it was. It wasn't very good. I don't think there was much to it at all. But it filled the role that I needed it to do at the time.
So your next game then is one I would love to play, but I'm completely intimidated by. And this is Here I Stand. Mm. So you also said that what you used to do Sealed Knot or something similar, which is...
Yeah, it was earlier era than Sealed Knot, but the principle is the same, yeah.
Yeah, so that's battle recreation.
Yeah.
I mean, how important is history for you?
Again, these are very interesting questions, and I don't know. Important is a strange word. I love history. I'm fascinated by history in the same way that I'm fascinated by the riddle of dinosaurs and mysterious animals of the deep ocean. It's that unknowingness of an alien world that I desperately want to bring to life again. I've never studied history professionally or academically. I'm not going to sit here and give you some lecture on the importance of history for making decisions in the modern world, because I don't know if it has any, or what that would... It probably has. I don't know. I'm not going to go down that road. I just find it really fascinating that long vanished life, even 100 years ago, how totally different the world was from how it is now, and 100 years before that, and how all these things feed into the world, the people, the culture that we are today, the situations that we're in today.
And so Here I Stand is a game that deals with the Reformation and all of the sort of the politics that went along with it. How well do you think it explains the era that it's set in? How realistic does it feel?
I think it feels moderately realistic. War games are always an abstraction. There is this drive in wargaming to more and more detail, more and more complexity, make it more and more like real life. But fundamentally, in real life, you don't roll a dice to decide whether or not somebody shooting at somebody else is going to hit them and kill them. It is fundamentally always an abstraction, and I am very wary of games that push that angle, that simulation angle, too hard. It's more about bringing out the real essential qualities of an era and making them interesting to gamers. And I think Here I Stand does that very well, because really what it tells you, it's human nature writ large, really, which is that it for all the high ideals at the heart of the Reformation about making the Bible, making religion more accessible to the man in the street, if you like. And remember, this was an era when, of course, everything was religious. Everyone was religious. There was no, almost no alternative way of looking at the world. And so making it more accessible was a revolutionary thing to do. But what it shows you is that how quickly and how wholly and how effectively that was co-opted by and into the business of running the power of a nation state.
And so what brought you to the Reformation? Did the Reformation bring you to Here I Stand, or did Here I Stand bring you to the Reformation?
Now, I think I have to explain at this point. This is the game. Here I Stand is the game. When I said earlier that there was one that wouldn't probably trouble my top 50, it's Here I Stand. And it's not because I don't like Here I Stand. I think it is a wonderful game. But it is a game that I after playing a couple of times, I passed my copy on, because you need a day to play Here I Stand. And I do not have a day to devote to playing a single game anymore. And I am presuming that come the apocalypse, there will be more time to kill. So I'll get the chance finally to sit down and give Here I Stand the proper airing that it deserves. I've played it more than a couple of times because, again, I've played it online with people. So I've played it more than a handful of times. But I did not pick Here I Stand because I have a particular interest in the Reformation. I like history as a broad sweep. There are lots of bits of history that I like. And I picked Here I Stand not because of the Reformation, but because it is a game that it ticks so many boxes. It is a thrilling recreation of history. Again, it's the playing of cards. It's got that thing, the playing of cards and moving counters on a map. More so than that, it is an original card-driven game, in the sense that people talk about card-driven games to be anything where you play a card and something on a map moves. There is a kind of like a genre within that, card-driven war games, that all run on basically the same system, and it's the system that you see highly abstracted in Twilight Struggle, where you've got ops on a card and cards that are tied often to one faction or another. And I love that to bits. Twilight Struggle is actually my favourite game. I've played it too much to want to play it into the apocalypse, to be honest, but it is the game I've had the most fun playing. So there's that aspect of it as well. Here I Stand is also a really critical negotiation game. So like Diplomacy, built into the turn structure, you have, I can't remember, 10 minutes every turn, 20 minutes every turn to talk to other people around the table, to make deals. So it's very much a game that ticks a lot of boxes for me, and which I could see myself, because it's so very... Every faction in Here I Stand, each one of the 6 factions in Here I Stand, plays differently. It has its own rules. So in terms of variety, in terms of just length of playtime, in terms of killing time for the apocalypse, if you like, it was when I thought about it, like I wanted to include a card-driven war game, it has to be Here I Stand. So it's the game itself rather than the Reformation, I suppose, to go back to your original question.
So I want to go on now and talk about 2 terms that it seems to me are actually being used less and less as time goes on, but this is Euro and Ameritrash. So in the bio you sent me, you said that you started to become annoyed by the preponderance of Euro games. What does that mean, and what was your issue? So
what it was really is it's that was probably unfair, looking back on it, to say the preponderance. I'm not saying that I wasn't annoyed. I'm saying that it was probably unfair of me to look at things through that day. I came to look at things, at gaming, through the lens of Board Game Geek, essentially, because it was the number one place on the internet. And in doing that, I kind of forgot all the other games out there, because people who play Games Workshop games, again, for the sake of argument, don't tend to come to Board Game Geek, at least they didn't in those days. So in the Board Game Geek community, there was definitively a focus on Euro games, medium and heavyweight Euro games. I have various issues with those games, in the sense that I don't like a lot of them, basically. And I saw in that community I thought actually quite arrogant dismissal of the kind of games that I liked for being, they're just, just for kids, they're random, full of plastic toys. Who would waste their time with these when you could be playing big, serious games for grown-ups, sorts of things. And I found that very rude and very dismissive, and it made me quite angry. And I wanted to show people that the kind of games I loved were more than that, and give that community a place on Board Game Geek.
So you coined the term Ameritrash.
I did not coin the term Ameritrash. I was part of a small group of people that did, and I can't remember who came up with it. Might have been me, might have been somebody else. So I was certainly intimately involved with the choosing. So we deliberately chose a name. We wanted to choose a name for these games, and we chose one as a group. And I don't know whose idea it was, but yeah, there was a small group of us, and we actively chose the name between us.
So what does the term Ameritrash encompass?
To this day, I'm not entirely sure, is the honest truth. With any genre, there are always going to be dozens of edge cases, and we invented this term and people wanted to know what it meant, and every definition you can, it's like nailing jelly to a wall, isn't it? There's always a way around it. There's always a slippery thing that makes it not mean what you think it means. Essentially, it is the wide space between the sort of analytical, heavier, medium to heavy Euro games on the one side, and the long-winded war games on the other. It is games that celebrate excitement and narrative and drama, and which tend to have trashy themes, which is where the Ameritrash comes from.
And so you started a community, you started Fortress Ameritrash. What was the purpose of that? Did you want to bring a home for people who... Because I remember I went on the Fortress Ameritrash message boards one day, and I was reading them, and people were sort of talking about Euro games and talking about them in terms of, oh my God, I just felt like I did my taxes. It seemed like a place for people to be defiant in the face of Eurogames. Was that what it was? Yeah, absolutely. Unquestionably, that is how it started. And if I'm honest, I may catch some flack for saying this, but we've been running a long time now. That site's been running quite a long time. And I think that we are now trying to live down that. We're trying to grow beyond that adversarial, rebellious beginning, if you like, to become a broader site about games, a more analytical site about games. But we keep on being sucked back into that, the genesis of our community, which was very much defining ourselves against something, defining ourselves against what was the dominant narrative in board gaming at the time. I mean, the name of the site implies that, right? Well, it's not called that anymore. So we changed it a couple of years ago, and it is now called There Will Be Games. And so what do you think an Ameritrash game gives you that a Euro game can't? A lot of things. It gives you a story. Very few Euro games give you a story, in my opinion. Some do. Again, we're nailing jelly to the wall. I want to define stuff down. But generally, you get a lot more of a rich narrative. You get a lot more excitement, unpredictability, drama. You get a lot more of an opportunity to be with people. Now, I know that obviously you play games, everyone plays games in a group, that they are social activities, but a lot of Euro games are very much head-down games where you are competing against yourself, essentially, just to do the best optimization puzzle that you can. You might as well, in the most extreme examples, you might as well be sit down trying to competitively solve the same crossword puzzle.
So I think Ameritrash games give you a more direct connection with the people that you're playing with.
And, I said at the beginning that people are using the terms less and less, and I see that. And do you think with the cultural interchange that you've had between American game designers and European game designers, do you see these terms becoming obsolete eventually? And do you see that hybrid games will be the norm?
I very much hope so. And I think it's something that I admitted and looked forward to from the beginning, from the genesis of the site. Because if you sit down, you asked me earlier about nostalgic games. Yeah, I'm nostalgic about games. But if I'm actually really honest, if you go back to the 18s, a lot of the games were just garbage. I mean, they were colourful and they had these fun themes and that was great. But design-wise, compared to modern things, they're poor. They are overlong. There's nothing wrong with randomness in games. There's nothing wrong with absolute insane chaos. But if you're going to play, I love games like that. But if you're going to play a game like that, it needs to be short. Dungeon Quest, game I'm very, very fond of. Almost zero strategy, brilliant excitement, fantastic drama, wonderful narrative, so much fun. But you can wrap a game up in 30, 40 minutes. That's fine, But when you've got that approach to kitchen sink dice rolling, card drawing gaming that goes on for 3 or 4 hours, it's like, no, we don't need that. We don't need that. Ameritrash had so much to learn from Eurogames, especially the early Eurogames, as I say, where there were these wonderful little packages. Look at Settlers of Catan. That's not a bad example. There's a lot of theme in Settlers of Catan. There's a lot of narrative, and yet it is a simple and compelling and interesting game to play. So we had lots to learn, and I really wanted to see those lessons applied to the themes and the styles of games that I loved, and I didn't like the way that a lot of Eurogames at around about the turn of the millennium were turning into these spreadsheet tax returns, point salad, kind of dry, boring games. I thought, we can do better with these lessons. And games like War of the Rings, the absolute poster child for this, began to appear. And now I think it's come full circle, where not only are Ameritrash games become very good at learning, very good from learning lessons from the European design community, but finally those kinds of very dry and abstract Eurogames are beginning to go out of fashion, and you're getting games you're coming back to games like Caravan, like I talked about earlier, where you've got these simple games that still have interaction, excitement, and a modicum of theme, and absolutely, yeah, hybridization is the way to go. Both camps can learn from each other and benefit as a result.
So your next game then is a game that makes a very definite satirical statement about where they see power lying in the world. And this is Imperial. How well do you think Imperial, how does it model the shady goings-on behind the Thrones of Power?
I don't believe it does, actually. It is, as you say, it is an incredibly cynical game. For those who are not familiar with it, it essentially posits that the First World War was controlled entirely by and for shady financiers who could literally contribute money to governments in order to get them to put their military facilities at their disposal. And I do not believe, from what I've read of the First World War, that this happens at all. I am not a fan of conspiracy theories generally. That does not mean that global finance does not cause wars, because I suspect it does, but not in that wholly deliberate, cynical fashion. There's not this grand scheme to yoke the governments of the world under the heel of mighty capital. It is just an unfortunate, messy collision of money and power and violence. So from the point of view of being a simulation, no, I don't think it is a particularly compelling picture of how the First World War came about or actually unfolded, but that doesn't stop it being a damn good game. And it's worth mentioning that there is a sci-fi version of it as well, Imperial 2030, where they've jettisoned that. I mean, the mechanics are identical, but it's got a different board, essentially. But they've gone away from the idea of it being a First World War simulation and turned it into more what it is, which is just an exploration of how money and power and force collide.
I mean, but with any sort of... When I played it, I didn't see it as a simulation of the First World War. I saw it like any act of satire, that it was speaking about the modern day. It was speaking about any act of satire that works. I mean, to what degree does it turn you on to thinking that maybe those people we see giving speeches aren't the ones that are actually pulling the levers?
I think it can do that. I think it is too abstract to really make people consider that. It's a game with a great deal of mechanical depth, I think, Imperial. And when I play it, I am sucked under by the mechanical and social depth of the game, and I don't tend to reflect a lot on the satirical elements of it, if you like. I do more so perhaps after the game. But if you compare it to something like, say, War on Terror, which is that is unquestionably a deliberate satire on the one hand, and on the other hand, a game like Labyrinth, the War on Terror, which is not a satire, but which is a deliberate attempt to look at the way in which government interference in the politics of other countries can backfire. Those elements are very much buried in compared to other games that sort of like sit in the same thematic territory, if you like.
And we've been talking about Ameritrash and Eurogames. I mean, where does this game sit on that scale?
It's very much a Eurogame, but it is not a spreadsheet game. So this is something that I have to, it's worth exploring at this point, I suppose, because we're talking about it. But a big problem that I have with a lot of dominant Eurogames, or as were, it's these point salad games. It's this idea that you are just solving an optimization puzzle and that you are divorced from what other players are doing, largely, other than, I'm going to be the first to take the 7-point token so that you're only left with the 6-point token sort of thing. Imperial is absolutely direct, in your face. It's in game parlance, it's a zero-sum game. You take something off somebody else, they lose it, and you gain it. Yeah?
Do you think... You say that this game doesn't, and you say that something like the War on Terror does. Do you think that games can say something about the state of the world? Can they make political statements? Can they make satirical statements? Can they make the sort of statements that a novel can make about who we are as people?
Yes. Perhaps not as effectively as a novel, but definitively they can. I don't think there's any question about that. And I think this is actually a really underexplored aspect of gaming and game design. I'm going to, because it's the uppermost in my head, the first time I played Labyrinth as the jihadists, I played a card called Martyrdom Operation, and in the game it allowed me to flip a couple of counters over and the game carried on. In my head, that was a suicide bomb. In my head, I just killed 30 to 50 innocent people. And I felt physically sick playing that card, genuinely felt physically sick playing that card. And I absolutely think that games are a brilliant window into examining these sorts of things because you are there, you are part of the decision-making processes. Do you know about Brenda Ramiro's games? Yeah. Train and things like that. So again, for people who aren't aware, Train is a I'll be spoiling it for you if you ever do play it. It's a game you only ever play once. It's a game about optimizing rail transport, Brenda Ramiro's game, Train. And at the end of the game, you discover that the optimization transport that puzzle you've been solving is the transporting of Jews to the gas chambers. And that is absolutely devastating. I've never played it, but just imagine yourself in that seat for a moment. I've spoiled the surprise now, but imagine before this blew up in the world of board games media, how horrific that would have made you feel, how that would have made you reflect on what you might call the banality of evil, the fact that there were people who sat and did this. there is a huge potential for games to help us get closer to their subject matter, arguably in a way that a video game can't do. So, a novel can't do because you're not a part of it, a film can't do because you're not a part of it, a video game can't do it because it's not transparent, a board game is transparent, you see all the moving bits, if you like. And so they have a fairly unique place, I think, in that cultural context, cultural cachet, which is not explored enough.
So I want to go on now and talk about your game writing. So how does blogging on BGG turn into a professional gig?
Luck. There is. I can't stress this enough. When I first started writing professionally, I wanted to pretend that it was a wonderful thing that was to do with the quality of people's writing. I mean, obviously, you have to be a good writer to do it, but good writers are 10 a penny. In the world at large, there are good writers that end up being technical writers for big IT companies. There are good writers who end up writing marketing copy and strap lines for your favourite annoying internet advert or whatever. Good writers are not hard to find. I was simply in the right place at the right time. I was doing my blogging. My daughter had just turned about 3 and was just discovering iPads, and I saw a message on Twitter from an editor who was, because this is not long after iPads came out, and you remember how important they were to gaming when they came out. Everyone was going, "My God, what amazing! What an amazing device on which to play a digital board game, because you touch, you feel, you're there, and they were." And so that they were an exciting time for technology. Kids were enjoying them because you can play a game on an iPad in a way that you don't need the dexterity of a mouse and a keyboard. Toddlers can play with them. They're great. And so toddlers were starting to play with them, and an editor wanted a gamer with kids to write about these very simple interactive toys, if you like, that kids were beginning to enjoy. And I was there, and I said, yes, I am that person. I can do that. I've been blogging for years, and I've got a daughter, and I've been playing video games for years. And he said, yeah, great, the gig's yours. And there was nothing more to it than that. And the fact that I got one then gives you that confidence, like, my God, yes, I've got one, yes, I'm good enough to do this. Perhaps I'm good enough to do something else.
And so there's been a lot of lamenting and ripping of garments about what goes into a good review. When it comes specifically to board games, not reviewing in general, what makes a good board game review?
That's a good question. I used to read board game reviews before buying a game. So if I wanted a new game, I would, I'd read a few board game reviews, and I'd look at the information in them, and I would think about, I'm going to use this information in one way or another to help me decide to buy a game, and that was fine. And after doing that for years, and I was writing reviews at the same time, so I was reflecting on this a lot, it dawned on me that when you read board game reviews and you look at the comments underneath, most of the replies are from people who've already played the game. Yes, I agree with this review, it's great. No, I don't agree with this review, I want to tear your eyes out and with a spoon and stick them on cocktail sticks. And if most people who are replying to board game reviews have already played the game, that kind of suggests that a lot of people who are reading them have played the game. Now, why would somebody that's played a board game read a board game review if they're using it as to help decide what board game they're going to buy? And furthermore, when you think back to your own buying habits, how many board game reviews have really helped you in making good decisions, and how much of it has been pot luck and how much of it has been your instinctive reaction to the box art or what your friend said or whatever? I don't think that board game the primary purpose of a board game review is to help people choose board games. I think the primary purpose of a board game review is to start a conversation about what is good and bad about that board game, and from there to inspire players and designers to do better. And so, from my point of view, that is what a good board game review is. It is something that elucidates what is unique and interesting and fun about a game, and opens up that dialogue about what else can we do with these ideas?
So what I've noticed about board game reviews is there's almost no focus on craft, on the structure and craft of a review. If they've improved over the last 5 years, it seems to be that, people have got better at using their cameras and understanding what lighting is. Why do so few people focus on the craft of a review?
There's lots of reasons. Well, there's two basic reasons for that, I think. The first is that I do not watch or consume video reviews really at all. I do very occasionally, but generally I ignore them. So I don't know what goes on in that world at all. But that is the way things are going, sadly. And that is, so for that craft, if you like, the craft is the lighting and the framing and the picture. And the other reason is that there's no money in it. Because why would you spend, or it's not why would you, it is hard to motivate yourself to spend time really crafting a review if you are not, just sheer for the love of doing so. I don't get paid for most of what I write. I do get paid for some of it, for which I am extremely fortunate and lucky, as I've already said, but I put the effort in because actually I have got to a point now where I enjoy writing the reviews as much as playing the games, to be honest. I do love polishing reviews up and making them the best that they can be, and that gives me a lot of pleasure, but I think most people who review games are not in love with the writing in that way, and what they love is trying to describe the game. So why would they? If your focus of pleasure is the playing of the game and the talking about the game and not the writing about the game, why would you put that effort in if there isn't a damn good reason to do so?
So you've written the Haynes Manual on Board Games, and you also work on the Board Game Book. And this is proper professional work, which, as you said, most people don't do. How arduous is that? How arduous for you is the process of writing?
I don't find the process of writing that arduous. As I just said, I really enjoy it. It's like an in the zone thing. You get in the zone and you just pound the words out and out they come, and it's quite a thrill, really. I enjoy it, and then after that there is the more careful polishing, which is beautiful in its own way and enjoyable in its own way. Just making the roughly hewn words that you've got sparkle that bit more. Make sure you've got the points across that you can do in a structure and a manner that is, a narrative from beginning to end, and which has short sentences and active participatory verbs, etc. So, all that stuff. I really enjoy doing that. So I don't find it arduous. I find it a pleasure. But I found writing the Haynes Manual tough. That was hard work. I find writing the Board Game Book much less so, and that's partly because he's not my project alone. There is an editor who has to make all the really difficult decisions about what goes in and how it's laid out, and so on and so forth, whereas with the Haynes Manual, that was all mine. I had to do that myself, and that was hard.
And so fundamentally, what do you think you offer board game writing? What is your particular skill? I
don't know. Is the honest answer. I really don't know. I've been very lucky to have all these opportunities, and I hope I've fulfilled them well. I have, over the past couple of years, found, I think, really my own voice. For people who may not have read my work, my reviews nowadays, I frame them all as stories. So rather than just talking about the games in an abstract or the third person, I actually tell a story about how I encountered the game, how my initial plays unfolded, and I try and make it into a narrative with an interesting and meaningful end, because I think I decided that was a really good way to bring out, fundamentally, if you want to know about a game, what better way than to play it? And if you can't play it, what better way than to read about someone playing it, especially if that's been written with a view to elucidating a critical dialogue rather than merely a session report. So that's become something that I think perhaps that I can offer that other people can't, but that's really recent. I've only been doing that for 18, 24 months. Before that, I don't know. I don't know why people like my stuff. I'm very pleased that they do, and I hope they continue to do so, and it gives me a lot of pleasure to write and to be read.
So your next game then is a game that is intimately concerned with story, and this is Once Upon a Time. Is this a game or is this an activity?
It's a game. It's a game. And I think it's a really interesting question to ask because it forces you to think about what a game actually is. Because as gamers, as strategy gamers, we are used to thinking about games in terms of strategy. That a game must have strategy, it must have a tight set of rules, definitions in order to be a game. And this is partly why gateway games fail. Because we go, oh, this game, Seven Wonders, brilliant gateway game. Anyone can play this. It's wonderful. We'll draw people in with this, and they'll get in to be the hobby. But fundamentally, most people don't see games as being strategy games. Strategy is not what interests them about games. What interests them about games is a structured way of having fun. And when you look at the definition of a game, that is all it is. It's a structured way of having fun. Stick in the Mud is a game. Tag is a game. They are no less games than A Feast for Odin or Puerto Rico. And it would do everyone well, I think, in the hobby to remember that more often.
So we have novels, we have films, we have plays. Why do we need games to convey narrative to us? Don't they offer a different space in the same way that music occupies a different space?
Yes, no. I mean, I used to be a big fan of the works of, I suppose I still am, of the works of Wilfred Owen and Benjamin Britten, the classical composer Benjamin Britten, took all of Wilfred Owen's, or some of Wilfred Owen's poems, and set them to music in a work he called War Requiem. Now, so the point of that is to illustrate that no art form sits still. No art form sits in a pot and sits neatly there and says this is this and other things are other things. There has always been value, artistic value, in it blurring the boundaries between different media. And it goes back to what I said earlier in terms of, the differences between novels and games. Games put you in a different position to that of a novel. As a novel, you are consuming somebody else's artistic vision. In a game, even a very, very heavy narrative-driven game, and there probably is no more narratively heavily driven game than Once Upon a Time, you are a participant in creating your own art.
So I want to talk now about the future. So what do you have coming up in the future?
I wish I knew. So there is a Kickstarter happening next month for another edition of the board game book, and hopefully that will get funded, and I will take great delight in doing my part for that book if it comes along. I have spent the last couple of years doing quite a good trade in writing about tabletop games for video gaming websites, because they are enjoying a real golden age in terms of popularity. They're becoming more and more popular and more widely known. And there was this great flurry of interest a year or two ago in trying to capitalise on that, which obviously didn't happen because I wrote those things and they had these features that ran for a few months and then the money dried up. So clearly they were not getting the traffic in still. Still there are not the numbers there to support it as a commercial entity writing and talking about video games. So once that is done, I really don't know what I'm going to do. I said to you when we spoke before that I try very hard to remember what it's like to be on the other side of the fence, to be somebody that reads the kind of content that I now create, and how lucky I am to have crossed that boundary. But it does come with the downside, and one of the downsides is that, the number of new games that comes across my desk is phenomenal. I do not remember the last time that I had a game, a big meaty game, time-consuming game that I really enjoyed, that I had the opportunity to play it more than, a dozen times, if that. And I miss that. And part of me wants to actually just go, God, I've got so many great games. I just want to play my great games and not worry about the new stuff. But as long as I can find inspiration to write and there are people who want to read it, it will be very hard to do that. So I don't know. I'm not good. I have no plans. I drift along with this. I have a full-time job, and there is no way that I can make writing, consume any more of my time than it already does, writing and gaming, because I need that job. I have a family to support. So I don't know what the future holds. I am very lucky so lucky to have been blown where the winds of fate have blown me, and I'm quite content to coast along them. People say to me this, what would you like to do? And I really don't know. I don't know what I would do. I am content to ride the winds of fate for now.
So your last game then is probably the most popular war game out there, I would say, and this is Memoir 44. Why do you think this game is so successful? Why has it captured the imagination?
There are lots of reasons why. I mean, the commands and colours system. So it's based on the commands and colours system, which is a very brilliant idea, which has been disgustingly abused. So you have the battlefield is in 3 sections, left, right and centre, and you have cards, and your cards say things like move 2 units on the left-hand flank, or move 3 units on the right-hand flank. There's more to it than that, but essentially that's what it is. So it is a really, really simple way of modelling command confusion, if you like, in war games. If you're interested in that, if you're not, you don't have to care. It's just fun to work out what best to do with your cards and the limited resources that you've got on the board. So it is that thing again about playing cards and moving stuff on a board. It's a fun interplay, as I've already described. I think most people recognised it to be a fun interplay. It's probably the simplest game, or one of the simplest games, that has that interplay but has enough in it to make it interesting. And when it came out, for people of a certain age, it's got that toy soldier factor. It's going to remind you, the pieces are going to remind you of the games you played on your living room carpet as a kid, and that's partly why it's big. And everybody knows the theme as well. It's something that was still in living memory, is still living memory to some extent now, but very much so when it came out, because I think it came out on the anniversary, one of the anniversary of the D-Day landings. I can't remember now, but. So, yeah, very popular theme, big nostalgia value with the toy soldiers, and an accessible, exciting, fun game.
And so you talked about the command and colour system and how it's been abused. I mean, do you think this is the best iteration of it?
No. It begs why I pitched it, which I'll come back to in a minute. If you want to sit down and play a single game, the best iteration of it is Commands and Colours Ancients, I think, beyond question, because it has a far greater link between the way the mechanics work and the actual realities of battlefield combat. You call it a war game, Memoir 44. War gamers hate it as a general rule because it is a very poor fit for the way that actual combat and command worked during the Second World War. That confusion, the way the battlefield being devoted into sectors, is a much better fit for ancient warfare, where there weren't radios, there wasn't aeroplanes, there weren't armour and things like that, and line cohesion across those sectors of the board, if you like, was critical to overwhelming your opponent. So if I'm going to sit down and play a single game, Commands and Colours Ancients every time. The reason I picked Memoir 44 is because of the enormous variety that comes with this game. It has expansions coming out of the wazoo, and many of those, not all of them, as I say, the system as a whole has been abused. It's used for every era you can imagine. Every era of warfare, there is a Commands and Colours game, and you don't need that many. You've got Memoir 44, you've got Commands and Colours Ancients. Just that's it. You can leave it there. It's fine. We're done now. That's good. But Memoir 44 has this huge variety of different theatre, different supplements, different armies, different scenarios that could keep you going for years and years and years. And best of all, and unfortunately it's out of print now, it has the campaign books, which are just a joy.
So I've got one last question for you. So you're heading out of the city, you're driving towards the cabin, 88 miles an hour, and you go around a corner, and the back door flies open. 4 of the games fly out of the car, down a ravine, into a river, and are swept away to posterity. Which game do you hope is sitting on the back seat of the car?
Well, I didn't want to think. So you told me you were going to ask me this question, and I didn't want to think about it, and because it's like, my God, I had hard enough time choosing 5. How am I going to just choose one out of all that one? And I thought, I'm going to decide as we talk about the things. It'll come out in my head what the answer to this is, and the answer is, and to my considerable surprise, Here I Stand. The one game that actually I would rate probably the lowest of all the games in that I've chosen today is the one that I would choose to keep, because it is so rich and ticks so many boxes and has the potential to do so many things for me. To represent so much of what I love in gaming in a single game. That's why I would pick Here I Stand. It is so much of what I enjoy, of what gives me pleasure in a single title.
So, if people want to get hold of you, see what you're writing, all of that sort of stuff, how would they go about doing that?
You can, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm very active on Twitter. My handle is MATTTHR, because I don't have the most internet-friendly name. And you can also check out, I publish at least once a fortnight on there, willbe.games, so you can check out my work there as well. And you can look at my books, the Haynes Manual of Tabletop Gaming and the Board Game Book Volume 1, hopefully Volume 2 coming up soon. But if you don't know who I am or what I do, just Google my name. I've written for the Video Game Press, and a lot of my stuff will come up in the articles. Articles I've written will come up alongside other strange people called Matt Thrower, who include internet designers and a fairly fiery Baptist preacher from the Deep South. But just look at the gaming content, you'll know where it is.
Well, Matt Thrower, thank you very much.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I think it's a delightful podcast, and it's a fascinating question. It's been a pleasure to be your guest today. Thank you for your time.
And if you want to suggest a guest, or if you want to say something nice about the show, or if you want to say something horrible about the show, you can contact me on @5gamesfordoomsday on Twitter, or you can send me an email at 5gamesfordoomsday@gmail.com. You can give a rolling donation to help support the show at patreon.com/5G4D, or a one-time PayPal donation at the bottom of the website 5gamesfordoomsday.com. And if I haven't had to abscond to save myself from the distressingly large taco shells and the ambulatory sewage pipes, I'll see you in 2 weeks for another 5 Games for Doomsday.